Have you ever stopped to think about how history might be hidden in unexpected places? When we think of Moab, the first image that comes to mind might not be the most glamorous. After all, Moab started its journey with a controversial episode and was often seen as a distant nation, shrouded in mysteries and conflicts. But what if I told you that there's much more than meets the eye? That behind the pages of the Bible and the layers of history, Moab reveals deep secrets about divine inclusion in God's redemptive plan for all nations. When we talk about the Moabites, the first thing that grabs attention is the controversial origin of this civilization. It all began with a story told in Genesis 19, where Lot, Abraham's nephew, and his daughters are involved in a perplexing episode. After the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot's daughters, fearing there would be no men to continue their family line, took drastic measures. The result of this union was Moab, a direct ancestor of the Moabites. It's not the kind of glorious beginning most nations take pride in, but here we are, at the heart of one of the greatest mysteries in biblical history. Now, before judging this origin as a mere scandal, it's worth considering the cultural and social context of that time. Lot's daughters acted out of desperation, at a moment when the survival of their lineage seemed at risk. It's interesting to note how, even in the most unusual situations, God uses these stories to weave something greater. Who would have guessed that from this controversial lineage would come important figures like Ruth, who would later become a key player in the story of Israel? The story of the Moabites is proof that God turns the unexpected into something significant. Furthermore, this origin serves as a reminder that birth circumstances do not always determine destiny. The Moabites had a complex relationship with the people of Israel throughout the Old Testament, one that fluctuated between political alliances and severe tensions. Just like in our lives, where the start of a journey doesn't always reflect the end, the history of the Moabites shows that even unlikely origins can contribute to grand narratives. If you look closely, this also mirrors our own paths. How often do we find ourselves judging things by their beginnings, when there is still so much to unfold? What the episode of Lot and his daughters teaches us is that the story of a person, or a people, is never summed up by the first chapter. And this raises an interesting question: how are you viewing the beginning of your own story? Have you considered that something much greater might be waiting ahead? With this reflection, we begin to open the door to understanding how the Moabite lineage not only survived but ended up influencing later generations in unexpected ways, leading to Ruth, the next key piece in this unfolding narrative. Despite its humble beginnings, the Moabite lineage leads to Ruth, the ancestor of King David and Jesus Christ. The story of Ruth is one of those incredible examples of how God works in unexpected ways. Imagine, a Moabite, born from a lineage full of scandals and prejudices, becoming a crucial link in the genealogy of King David. Not only that, but she is also part of the lineage of Jesus Christ. It's almost as if God is reminding us that complicated origins can have a much greater purpose. Ruth, by marrying Boaz, an Israelite, becomes a living example of redemption and transformation. What's even more fascinating is how Ruth chose faith amid adversity. She could have stayed in Moab with her people, but she decided to follow Naomi, her mother-in-law, and adopt the God of Israel as her own. This is significant because it shows how love and loyalty can transform lives. Ruth becomes not only an important figure in Israel's history but also an example of faith that transcends cultural barriers. In the end, Ruth's story reminds us that it doesn't matter where we come from, but where we are going. If you think about it, Ruth's decision to embrace something new, to leave her land and culture behind, is something we all face at some point. Sometimes we need to step out of our comfort zones, leave the past behind, and open ourselves up to what's ahead. Ruth did this with faith, and we are also called to do this in various areas of our lives, whether in career decisions, relationships, or even spirituality. What might you learn from her story to apply to your own journey? Through Ruth, we see how God is not limited by the boundaries set by humans. Even as a Moabite, a foreigner, she was welcomed, and her love story with Boaz produced a lineage that would change the course of human history. She broke through prejudices and demonstrated that faith and character matter more than any origin or nation. Imagine the impact you can have when you choose to follow your principles, regardless of your initial circumstances. With this in mind, we turn to another important piece of this puzzle, the geographical location of Moab, which, despite the tensions, also facilitated valuable cultural and economic exchanges with Israel. Geographically, Moab's location near Israel influenced its cultural and economic exchanges. Moab's geographical location, to the east of the Dead Sea, kept its people in constant contact with Israel. This proximity, while leading to conflicts throughout history, also facilitated rich cultural and economic exchanges between the two civilizations. Imagine two neighboring nations, sharing borders and inevitably interacting, even if sometimes in a tumultuous manner. It's like door-to-door neighbors who, despite their differences, always end up crossing paths. The trade routes that passed through Moab facilitated these interactions. The Moabites, with their resources and skills, provided products that Israel wanted, while the Israelites, in turn, had what Moab needed. It was a relationship of mutual dependence, despite being fraught with political and religious tensions. This shows us that even amidst disagreements, there's always something to be learned and shared. Think about your own life. How many times have you encountered someone completely different from yourself, yet they somehow contributed to your growth? This close interaction over the years led to the blending of cultural traits between the two peoples. Despite religious and ideological differences, there were moments of collaboration and learning. Similarly, in our daily interactions, no matter how different we might be from others, there's always an opportunity to learn something new. Whether it's a new way of thinking, a different perspective on the world, or even practices we can incorporate into our own lives. If we look closely, this cultural blending shaped both the Moabites and the Israelites. Archaeologists and historians suggest that even certain religious aspects, such as rituals and worship practices, were influenced by this proximity. For example, some Moabite customs were adopted by Israel. This illustrates how cultural exchanges are inevitable when two civilizations coexist so closely. Who would have thought that geography could influence a people's destiny so significantly? Now that we understand the geographical and cultural impact, let's delve into the next fascinating aspect of this story, the archaeological discoveries that reveal even more about the sophisticated society of Moab. Archaeological discoveries such as the Mesha stele and pottery reveal the sophisticated society of Moab. Archaeological finds provide a fascinating glimpse into the past, and in the case of the Moabites, the Mesha stele is one of the key pieces that help us better understand this civilization. Discovered in 1868, this inscribed stone reveals a rich and complex history, highlighting the power and organization of the Moabites. The Mesha stele recounts the story of King Mesha, who boasts of having freed Moab from Israeli dominance. It is a direct testament to how the Moabites saw themselves, as a strong, resilient people proud of their autonomy. And it's not just the Mesha stele that gives us insights into the Moabites. Pottery found in excavations reveals a highly skilled people who knew how to use the resources around them to create everyday items as well as objects of religious value. These pottery pieces, with their refined details, show that Moabite culture had an aesthetic appreciation that is often underestimated. This leads us to reflect on how much we can learn from the past simply by examining the objects these civilizations left behind. What many might not realize is that pottery served more purposes than just storing food or liquids. In some ancient cultures, including that of the Moabites, certain vessels had ritual significance. The discovery of pottery with religious symbols, for example, suggests that the Moabites had a deep connection with the divine, expressed artistically. This makes us think, how do we manifest our faith or values in our daily lives? Perhaps not through pottery, but there's always something we use to symbolize our beliefs and traditions. Another interesting point is how these archaeological discoveries allow us to reconstruct Moab's economy and trade interactions. Pottery and other artifacts indicate that the Moabites not only produced goods for internal use but also traded with neighboring peoples. This reinforces the idea that Moab, though small, played a crucial role in the regional trade network. Just as today, when companies and nations seek to export their best creations, the Moabites did the same, using their skills to ensure a presence in the economic landscape of their time. Now that we've delved into the archaeological riches of Moab, the next step is to understand how relations with Israel evolved over time, with moments of tension and cultural exchange. The history of Moab and Israel shows tension, cultural exchange, and prophetic judgments. The relationship between Moab and Israel was marked by ups and downs. There were times of intense tension, with wars and territorial disputes, but also periods of cultural exchange, where the two peoples influenced each other's traditions and customs. This duality reflects how complex the interaction between these two civilizations was, as they were interconnected despite their differences. Think of moments when you found yourself in a conflict with someone close, yet you also realized there was something to learn from the experience. One of the most famous episodes of this tension was the story of Balaam, a prophet hired by the king of Moab to curse Israel. However, God intervened, and instead of cursing, Balaam ended up blessing the Israelites. This episode, recorded in the book of Numbers, shows us the power of prophetic interactions and how God, even in the face of hostility, guided the destiny of both peoples. It reminds us that often, even amid conflicts, there is a greater force working behind the scenes. However, it wasn't all about war and disputes. There were periods when Israel and Moab shared more than just borders. The cultural exchange between the two nations was evident in various areas, such as agriculture and trade. A notable example is the use of similar agricultural practices, demonstrating that despite their differences, there was an exchange of knowledge essential for the survival of both. Just as today, when people from different nations share technologies and innovations, the ancient Israelites and Moabites also learned from each other. The Israeli prophets, however, often viewed Moab as a nation under God's judgment. Prophecies from Isaiah and Jeremiah spoke of the destruction of Moab as a consequence of its pride and idolatry. These judgments, though severe, were accompanied by a promise of restoration. This shows us that even when there seems to be only condemnation, there is always a chance for redemption. And this is not unique to the history of Moab. We all, at some point, face judgments or difficult times, but there is always the possibility of a fresh start. Now that we've explored the dynamics between Moab and Israel, let's delve into the prophetic messages that highlight not only judgment but also the hope for future restoration. Prophetic messages about Moab include both judgment and future restoration. Biblical prophets, especially Isaiah and Jeremiah, dedicated several messages to the nation of Moab, emphasizing both divine judgment and the hope for future restoration. On one hand, Moab was often depicted as a proud and idolatrous nation, destined for destruction due to its sins. However, the interesting part is that these same messages of condemnation carried with them a promise of restoration. It seems contradictory, doesn't it? But therein lies the mystery: God always leaves a door open for repentance, even for seemingly doomed nations. Imagine, for instance, someone facing significant challenges in their life, where everything seems to be going wrong. The prophet's words for Moab might sound like a lesson that, no matter how severe the fall, there is always an opportunity to start anew. The judgment of Moab is described harshly, with cities being destroyed and people being exiled. Yet, amid this bleak scenario, the prophets speak of a time when God would show mercy and restore Moab. This cycle of downfall and redemption is something we can all reflect on in our own lives. Jeremiah, for example, describes Moab as a rich and prosperous nation that, due to its pride, would be destroyed. But at the end of his prophecy, there is a turnaround. God promises that, in the latter days, he will restore the fortunes of Moab. This reminds us that, in the divine view, no situation is irreversible. It is a powerful message about God's ability to transform even the worst scenarios. And isn't that how we often feel when, after a tough phase, we find a solution that leads to a new beginning? This future restoration of Moab is a metaphor for human nature itself. We may make mistakes, get lost in our own arrogance or failures, but there is always the possibility of renewal. In Moab's case, this renewal wasn't immediate but was a promise for the future, showing that God's timing doesn't always match our expectations. It's a lesson in patience and faith. Often, things don't resolve in our own time but in the right time, when we are ready for a true change. Now that we understand the messages of judgment and restoration, it's time to see how Moab's inclusion in the scriptures reveals something even greater: God's plan for all nations, not just for Israel. The inclusion of Moab in the biblical narratives highlights God's universal plan and love for all nations. Moab's presence in the scriptures is not just a historical detail but a clear demonstration that God's plan has always been universal, encompassing all nations. Despite its scandalous origins and constant tensions with Israel, the Moabites are featured in various biblical narratives, underscoring that God's love is not limited to a specific people or nation. Indeed, God is a deity who seeks to reach everyone, even those who, in human eyes, may seem distant or beyond the reach of divine grace. The story of Ruth is a perfect example of this inclusive love. She, a Moabite, was integrated into the people of Israel and became the great-grandmother of King David. This alone is proof that God can use anyone, regardless of their origins, to fulfill his purposes. Isn't it inspiring to think that, like Ruth, we can all be part of something greater, no matter our history or background? This message is powerful, reminding us that no one is excluded from God's redemptive plan. Moreover, Moab's inclusion in prophecies and biblical genealogies also reveals the divine intention to unite diverse peoples under a common purpose. The culture, religion, and even the geography of the Moabites were used to show that, despite evident differences, there is a shared path for all. It's like in our own lives: how often do we encounter people from different cultures or backgrounds who, in some way, play significant roles in our journey? This universal plan also challenges us to look beyond our own prejudices and divisions. Often, we tend to see the other as distant or irrelevant. However, the story of Moab teaches us that the other may be more intertwined with our destiny than we realize. It makes us reflect on how many opportunities for growth and learning we miss by not being open to these connections that God places in our path. Thus, as we recognize this divine inclusion of Moab, we begin to glimpse something even greater: the profound lessons this story offers about cultural interaction, God's sovereignty, and the complexities of human societies. But this is just the beginning. The lessons include cultural interaction, God's sovereignty, and the complexities of human societies. The story of Moab provides rich lessons on cultural interaction, God's sovereignty, and the complexities of human societies. When we think about the interaction between Moab and Israel, it's impossible to ignore how these two cultures, despite their tensions and conflicts, had opportunities to influence and learn from each other. Cultural exchange isn't new, it's a fundamental part of the growth and evolution of societies. Just as Moab and Israel shared practices and knowledge, our daily interactions with different cultures can teach us a great deal about the world and about ourselves. Moreover, God's sovereignty is clearly highlighted in the story of Moab. Despite wars and betrayals, the divine plan continued to unfold. God used the most unexpected circumstances to fulfill his purposes, demonstrating that his will transcends human limitations and worldly events. This sovereignty reminds us that even when everything seems out of control, there is a higher order guiding events. Life, with all its complexities, may often seem chaotic, but there is always a hand guiding the course of history. Human societies, with their complex and often conflictual dynamics, reflect how interaction between different groups can create both challenges and opportunities. The relationship between Moab and Israel is a microcosm of these dynamics, showing that even in the most adverse situations, there is room for understanding and growth. Each interaction, whether positive or negative, contributes to building a richer and more multifaceted society. Just as Moab and Israel had their moments of collaboration and conflict, we too can learn to navigate the complexities of our own social interactions. In the end, these lessons about cultural interaction and divine sovereignty challenge us to consider how we handle differences and challenges in our own lives. Instead of viewing difficulties as insurmountable obstacles, we can begin to see them as opportunities to learn and grow. This perspective helps us embrace diversity and recognize God's role in shaping our experiences. As we reflect on these lessons, it's important to remember that the story of Moab is far from an isolated narrative. It intertwines with God's grand plan for all nations and peoples, inviting us to delve deeper into the divine purpose in our own journey. The story of Moab challenges us to confront our prejudices and embrace God's redemptive plan for all people. The history of Moab invites us all to confront our own biases and embrace a deeper understanding of God's redemptive plan. Moab, with its controversial origins and tumultuous relationship with Israel, acts as a mirror reflecting our own attitudes toward others. The way Moab is portrayed in the scriptures challenges us to examine how we view those who are different from us and how often we maintain barriers that separate us from a broader and more inclusive understanding. As we consider the story of Moab, it's crucial to recognize that God shows no favoritism. Even the Moabites, who were viewed with skepticism and hostility by many Israelites, had a place in the divine plan. This aspect reminds us that God's love and redemption are not limited by cultural, ethnic, or social boundaries. In our own lives, this translates to a call to break down prejudices and open our hearts to the possibility that everyone, regardless of their origins, has intrinsic value and a role to play in the larger plan. Moab's inclusion in David's genealogy and, consequently, in Jesus' lineage, powerfully demonstrates that God can use any story to fulfill his purposes. Thus, when we confront our own prejudices, we might ask ourselves, are we allowing our limited perceptions to hinder the fulfillment of God's redemptive plan in our lives and the lives of others? The story of Moab challenges us to be more welcoming and to look beyond appearances and past histories, recognizing divine action in unexpected contexts. Moreover, the Moabite narrative offers a valuable lesson about the importance of repentance and transformation. Even those who begin with a complicated heritage can be redeemed and transformed by God. This encourages us not to give up on ourselves or others, but to continually seek the potential for change and renewal. This perspective is crucial, as it reminds us that redemption is always a possibility, regardless of initial circumstances. As we reflect on the impact of Moab's story on our worldview, we can begin to apply these lessons in our daily interactions. Recognizing the value and potential of each individual is an important step toward building a more inclusive and loving community. And as we explore the deeper meaning of this story, we can start to see how it fits into God's grand plan for all of us. Now that we've delved into the fascinating history of the Moabites, it's time to reflect on what these lessons might mean for us today. Moab's journey, from a controversial origin to its inclusion in biblical genealogies, challenges us to reconsider our own perceptions and biases. Are you ready to apply these insights to your life? How can we turn our prejudices into opportunities for growth and inclusion? Think about how you can embrace differences and seek redemption in unexpected situations, just as God did with Moab. If you found value and inspiration in this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.